quarantine from our homes. It is the common good, where we try to tell you and try to frame the issues of the day so you understand what's going on. And there couldn't be more important issues of this day and this week. Katie Milne, you are live from quarantine in your own house. I hope you're safe. This is the most important thing. You know, it's easy to get lost in the abstractions, you know, that the 3.5 million people lost their jobs at least last week. New claims for unemployment insurance, we found out this morning for last week. This week is probably going to be much worse. And we can talk about these numbers and we can talk about these abstractions, but this is about people. This is not just about the economy. This is about people. And I think one of the major themes that we have to stress, and a lot of our, well, some of our leaders and some of our columnists and pundits and others are missing the point that this is about lives and safety and people, and the economy is really the abstraction. Let's get back to people. So, Katie, what are you thinking about, and how are you doing?
Well, personally, I'm doing as well as I could be. Again, I'm incredibly grateful to have a safe home and a roof over my head that I can quarantine in, and I'm extremely lucky and grateful that I still have a job and that I can work from home. So in my personal life, I am doing okay, but systemically, I am very, very angry, Bob. And today I'm
Well,
not going to mince
join the
words.
club. Wait a minute, but wait. You say you're angry. Now, there are a lot of things
Yes.
to be angry about. Let's make some
hmm
priorities in terms of you.
Yes.
What are you angry about? I'll tell you what I'm angry about, but what are you angry about?
So I am angry, absolutely livid. It's going to take a lot of self-control to not drop a bunch of F-bombs and express my anger that way during this broadcast. I am angry because there are a lot of people in power who are more concerned about money and profits than people's lives. For instance, last week, the big news of the week was two Republican senators, Richard Burr of North Carolina and Kelly Loeffler of Georgia, I believe, both of them, while telling the public that everything was fine and that it's not a big deal, weeks before the stock market crashed, both of them sold off over $1 million in stock. Richard Burr on February 13th, he sold off about $1.62 million worth of stock, including his two biggest sales were in hotel chains. Then Kelly Loeffler, even before that, as early as the end of January, after all the senators received a classified briefing about coronavirus, she also sold off over $1 million in stock. And get this, then she bought stock in a teleworking company. And all the while, these two Republican senators are following the lead of Donald Trump and downplaying the severity of the crisis to the public and saying everything's fine, we're prepared, it's not going to be a big deal. So I am absolutely outraged that these two
Well, it
senators
should be
were,
out. You should be
I mean,
outraged. You should be angry. We all should be angry. We should actually insist that the two of them resign. They ought to be.
yeah.
They should not be there. This is called profiteering. It's called insider trading. This is illegal. They ought to be prosecuted. Now, they should be prosecuted even in normal times, but to do this in a time of public crisis when we have a pandemic, and they knew the pandemic was coming, and they hid this fact from the public, and they went along with the happy talk of Donald Trump. This is beyond outrage. This really is a matter of violating the public trust that they have or they had. That nobody should elect them, re-elect them. I don't care whether they're up for re-election or not. They ought to resign, and they ought to be prosecuted.
I totally agree. And another note, Kelly Loeffler's husband is the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange. And I just don't understand how, any of this is allowed. And so far, they haven't faced any consequences. I mean, there have been calls for them to resign, and I think they're both under Senate ethics investigations, but who knows what that's, going to turn out to be. So I'm just really angry that it looks like these two people blatantly violated the public trust, violated the law, violated their oaths to serve the public, and it looks like they might not have any consequences for it, face any
Well,
consequences for it. So,
hopefully, federal prosecutors actually do have some power and some independence. You know, the Southern District of New York, for example, where you have the New York Stock Exchange. I mean,
Yeah.
and there are federal prosecutors around that are not inhibited, or at least not unduly inhibited, by Barr, by Attorney General Rich Barr. And I hope that they go after these people, not only because they have violated the law, Burr and Loeffler, but also because they have violated at a time of national emergency, and they violated the public trust at a time when we are all looking to our leaders to give us some sort of direction and hope and leadership. So this is compiling the reasons for. I mean, this is not just a run of the mill insider trading
Yeah.
case. This is much worse than that. I'll tell you. Can I just, since you have contributed some of your own anger, my anger
Yes,
is that this
please.
new
Let's
bill.
hear it.
My anger is that this new Senate bill that just emerged, that the House is on the verge of giving a sort of approval to, pro forma, by unanimous consent or just ayes over nays. This bill has $500 billion for corporate bailouts and almost no constraints on CEO pay. There's sort of a kind of a little bit of a lid on CEO pay. If they made $3 million last year, they've got to anything over $3 million. They've got to have only a percentage of that over $3 million. This formula is just baloney. And why in the world aircrafts and cruise ships and hotels, including Donald Trump's hotels, have any reason to get any money from taxpayers at all now, when you have regular people, millions of people who are now home? They don't know how they're going to pay their bills. 80% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and they desperately need money right now. And we're the richest country in the world. And we can easily, I mean, in December of 2017, we gave a $2 trillion tax cut to big corporations and the wealthy. Big corporations used it to buy back their shares of stock, give their executives, line the linings of their executives, make their executives and make their major investors even richer. We're doing the same thing again. We're doing exactly the same thing we did before again. In fact, we're doing it for the third time, because in 2008, we did it for the big Wall Street banks. And we said, well, they got all these bank presidents and CEOs, they got all these bonuses, and they made off like bandits. And average working people lost their savings, they lost their jobs, they lost their homes. Not a single person on Wall Street was brought to justice. Certainly not any of the big kingpins of Wall Street. This is the third time in 10 years we've gone through exactly the same movie. And I for one, I'm furious. I think the public, if we were not so cloistered right now, and we have to be, if this were not a public health crisis, and it must be, and we must recognize it as such, once this is over, I certainly hope politically all of us remember who took advantage of this situation to pad their own nests.
I totally agree. And I'm just really glad we're on the same page in terms of how furious we are. So let's talk a little bit more about that
Well,
Senate
I
bill.
don't know if it does any good. I mean, well, you can be furious. You can be furious. I can be furious. We can be here, with hopefully a lot of other people who are sharing our anger and outrage. But I don't know where it gets us unless we turn this somehow into political mobilization next November. But let's just put a flag on that.
Yeah, and I think we will. But so let's talk more about the Senate bill. It's a massive $2 trillion emergency relief package. I totally agree with you. I think it's absurd that corporations are getting a $500 billion bailout with hardly any restrictions. There's a ban on stock buybacks, but only for the duration of the loan. There's a dismally inefficient or insufficient limit on executive pay. There's no worker protections. Businesses who get that loan don't need to keep their workers on their payroll, protect their benefits, none of that. No guaranteed $15 minimum wage. So the one thing Democrats did secure, and again, it's woefully inefficient or insufficient. So they got independent oversight of the recipients of the loans, and they also, none of Trump's businesses can benefit, or any of his family businesses. And so they got independent oversight, and the recipients of the loans have to be made public within 7 days, which all sounds good in theory. I mean, it's still, corporations shouldn't be seeing a cent of taxpayer money. But in the very next section that stipulates all those limits, turns out Treasury Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin can waive those restrictions whenever he wants, however he sees fit. So
Well,
those restrictions
that
don't
is, and
even
again,
do anything. I mean, it's absurd.
if this were an administration where they had earned our trust in terms of not engaging in self-dealing and not trying to take advantage of their power and privilege over the last 3 years, maybe we'd have some confidence that an inspector general would actually provide some independence and a secretary of the Treasury would take his responsibility seriously. But remember, this is an administration, and Donald Trump has been engaged in self-dealing, making money off of his office for much of the last 2.5, 3 years. And
Yeah.
you know exactly what's going to happen. I mean, Steve Mnuchin is from Wall Street. Steve Mnuchin will do exactly what Wall Street thinks and wants, and exactly what Donald Trump wants. And so this is just another taxpayer giveaway at a time when millions of Americans need money. Katie, did you notice how much money is being provided to average working people? Average people, in terms of the people who are going home now, staying home, can't work. It's a pittance.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the one really good provision in the bill was that it expanded unemployment insurance to make gig workers, contract workers, and self-employed workers eligible, and it added an additional $600 a week for the next 4 months on top of state unemployment benefits. So that's a huge, huge get, and that is really great. But because I had to laugh at how absurd this was. Yesterday, the bill was on the verge of being fast-tracked, but four Republican senators, Lindsey Graham, Rick Scott, Tim Scott, and Senator Cassidy, they all decided to lodge a last-minute amendment because they thought that the unemployment insurance expansion was too generous. They thought that because low-wage workers would make less than $600 a week on their normal salary, that $600 a week would encourage workers to stay laid off, to quit their jobs, to not re-enter the workforce. And Lindsey Graham actually said, and this is a quote, "Nurses are going to make $24 an hour on unemployment, which would incentivize workers to stay out of the workforce." I mean, Bob, what is happening? We're in the middle of an unprecedented global crisis that we've never seen before, and Republicans are literally worried that poor people are going to get too much money. I mean, what planet are we living on right now? So,
well, it's not
what are
clear.
your thoughts on this?
We're on planet Republican greed. That's the planet we're on. And remember, this is in the context of them just giving $500 billion to big corporations with almost no limits on executive pay. I mean, the mind boggles. What they obviously don't understand is that this is a public health crisis, and we want people to stay home for the good of all. In other words, everybody who stays home is helping slow the spread of the pandemic. We all need people to stay home. So if people are staying home and maybe a few people are making a little bit more money than they were making when they were actually on the job, is that such a horrible thing? That's what we want. I mean, that seems to be appropriate.
Yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous. And thank God Bernie Sanders, he had a really fiery, passionate speech on the Senate floor last night. And I just felt like I was so happy to see that because it felt like he was just channeling all this anger that I had. And he actually got them to stand down because he said, okay, you guys, if you're going to block this bill based on the unemployment insurance, then I'm going to block this bill. If you don't stand down, I'm going to block this bill because of this $500 billion bailout. So shout out to Bernie Sanders. He totally helped get this bill through. But so going back to your other point, speaking of how it's necessary for people to stay home and not work, there is another really dangerous sentiment that started going around where billionaires, from the comfort and safety of their own multi-million-dollar homes, they want to open the economy back open. And this is, okay, here's another direct quote. It's mind-blowing and infuriating. So this is from the former CEO of Wells Fargo. "We'll gradually bring those people back and see what happens. Some of them will get sick. Some may even die. I don't know. Do you want to suffer more economically or take some risk that you'll get flu-like symptoms and a flu-like experience? Do you want to take an economic risk or a health risk? You get to choose."
You know, Katie, the last decades of the 19th century, early and the first decades of the 20th century, there was something going around in right-wing conservative Republican circles called social Darwinism. I don't know if you ever heard the expression. It
Yes.
essentially meant that let's just let survival of the fittest be the operating principle in our society and in our economy. And if some people can't hack it, well, then just let's get rid of them. Maybe the economy and society would be stronger if we got rid of the weakest among us. That's what we are hearing once again. When the head of Wells Fargo, I heard the similar thing from the head of the senior chairman of the board of Goldman Sachs,
Goldman Sachs, yeah.
Lloyd Blankfein, said almost exactly the same thing. Let's get the economy back. Let's not be too overly concerned about the people who are going to get sick and die. The lieutenant governor of Texas just a few days ago said almost the same thing. He said, "Well, I'm old and I'm a grandparent. Grandparents like me, we ought to sacrifice ourselves so that young people can work. And even if we die off, what again? What are we talking about? The people who are most advantaged and privileged in this society, they know." They can work from home. They have a lot of money, even though their savings may have been cut somewhat, 30%, but doesn't matter. They still are better off than 95% of Americans. And it's easy for them to say, okay, everybody back to work. But the people who are actually going to be hurt the most are the people who are at the front lines and right directly in the vortex of this virus. And so the social Darwinist message that's just underlying the surface is, I think, again, morally repugnant. Tom Friedman, the columnist, New York Times columnist, said almost exactly the same thing a few days ago. I mean, again, these people are making a totem out of the economy. They somehow believe that human life and public health are not as important as something. What is this? The economy. What is the economy? The economy is nothing. The economy is a bunch of rules created by human beings for ideally the betterment of human beings. Well, human lives and human welfare are more important than this abstraction called the economy. And it's easy for the captains of industry and the head of the big banks, and even for a New York Times columnist to say we ought to get back to work, even if it does mean some sacrifices, because they know that they're not going to be the ones who have to take the sacrifice.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it's morally repugnant, and I can't even believe we're having a conversation about this. Literal billionaires want people to die so their stock portfolios can recover. I mean, if that's not class warfare, I don't know what is. And I'm floored that this is even a conversation where people are saying, sacrifice yourself so the Dow Jones Industrial Average can get a 0.3% bump. I mean, what planet are we on? And I want to talk about how, as you said, it's ridiculous that the most privileged and powerful among us are calling for the most vulnerable among us to go back into the front lines and sacrifice themselves. And the working class is going to hit really hard by this. But there are also the most vulnerable communities in normal times are going to bear the brunt of this. And I've been thinking about these communities that don't see any support in normal times, and even now, like, they're getting hit so hard by this. I mean, you've got native populations where they're at a higher risk for getting the virus, and then there's this thing where not everybody's home is safe to quarantine in. I mean, if you're living with a domestic abuser, your home isn't safe. And then there's the disabled community, and there's the prison population. I mean, at Rikers Island,
and Katie, there are the homeless people.
Yeah.
And there are the prisoners. I mean, people who have been incarcerated for minor infractions, and they are in kind of incubation centers with regard to this virus. Nobody's talking about all of these people. And then you've also got the hospital workers. I mean, the people who are actually on the front lines. If we were at war, and Trump calls himself a war president, if we were actually at war, we would not be sending our troops out into war without protective gear. And yet that's exactly what we are doing. I have a sister-in-law and I also have a brother-in-law. Both of them are nurses, separate hospitals, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, and they are not getting the protective gear they need, the masks, and their hospitals are saying, well, we can't afford it. We don't have it. They're not in supply. You have to go in and do your work anyway.
Yeah.
There's something fundamentally wrong about the allocation of power and privilege, and who we expect to do the work, and who is going to be hurt most, either because they're going to get the virus, or
Yes.
because they're going to be passing it on, or because they are going to lose their income and maybe their homes, and their livelihoods.
Yeah, I totally agree. And so this brings me to I have a question for you because as we discussed, we're both really angry. And these people with all this power and privilege, it just seems like they can get away with it. I mean, Larry Kudlow, almost exactly a month ago, said, "We have contained this. We've got it close to airtight. There's going to be some stumbles." All these people in power, it just seems like they can do whatever they want and they're never held accountable. So my question to you is, you've been fighting against these unequal power dynamics your entire career. Same with Bernie Sanders and all these other people. And so how do you keep fighting against them when it seems like nothing is ever getting better? Because I know for me, I am so infuriated and exasperated and frustrated, and I'm not giving up by any means, but it gets really hard when it just seems that these people with so much power can do whatever they want and don't face any consequences for their actions. So how have you been able to keep fighting against that and keep your fire, and what keeps you going? Because honestly, I really am kind of at a loss right now. So I just want to hear how you've stayed passionate and fiery over your career.
Well, that's a big question, and I
Yeah.
suppose that there are two answers. Number one, because what's the alternative? I mean,
Yeah.
if you're not fighting against this, if you're not angry, if you see it and you don't actually have a visceral reaction that there's something fundamentally unfair and unjust, and you don't care about this stuff, then what you can't accept it. You just simply can't accept it, and acceptance
Yeah.
is a kind of moral defeat that I don't think any of us
Mm,
want to fall into. But the second is that if you do, and I think there are people around who accept it and become very cynical, and cynicism
mm,
is the greatest enemy of social and political change. That's what the oligarchy, and I'm going to use the term, it's a wonderful old Greek term meaning
mm-hmm.
people with wealth and power. What the oligarchy wants more than anything else is for all of us to become cynical and jaded and expect that nothing will change. And then, of course, they win. Then nothing changes.
Mm,
Then they're free. They're home. They can clean up. I mean, Donald Trump actually was elected as a kind of fake populist. He told workers, the working class all across America, that he understood they had lost their jobs, that he was going to save them. And we now know, although unfortunately a lot of people still are under the illusion that he's a great working class hero, we now know that what he has done is provide big tax cuts for the wealthy and for big corporations, and regulatory rollbacks for the wealthy and for big corporations. And now this big bailout bill for the wealthy and for big corporations. And the illusion that he is somehow there for the American people has to be, well, it's absurd, and it needs to be shattered. If people are cynical, if they are cynical, they're not going to do it. If they believe him, they're not going to do it. I think what
yeah.
we have to, as we come up to this election, and let's not forget, this is all in the shadow of November. It may feel like we're all sheltering and we're not thinking about the next election, but we do have to think about the next election. As that next election emerges, we have got to, hopefully, we will be able to come out of our homes, but even to the extent that we are still sheltered, we've got to mobilize and organize and make sure that
Oh yeah.
he's out, and that administration is out, and the Republicans are not in control of the Senate, and the people in the Democratic Party who have authority and voice and power are progressives who understand that this is a matter of either democracy or oligarchy, and that they're on the side of democracy.
Yeah. Well, That does give me hope, and you're totally right. I mean, what's the alternative? Especially knowing how bad things are, because this pandemic has really laid bare to everyone just how broken our system is and just how unequal the power dynamics are in this country. So, what do you want to see going forward in terms of legislation and relief packages, and what is the next bill need to do? What needs to be included? Where do we go from here? We've got 3 bills passed already. What needs to happen next?
What's going to happen, I think, unfortunately, we have not seen the bottom. We are going to have more of this pandemic. More people are going to die. We're going to see some rationing going on.
Yeah.
Although, that is, I mean, talk about morally inappropriate and horrific. That kind of rationing in hospitals in terms of who lives and who dies. But average people are going to run out of money. I mean, working people are going to run out of money. They have to stay home. So this bill that was just enacted is going to take us through maybe through the end of April, or maybe through possibly the middle of May. But then there's going to have to be another piece of legislation. And I think that next bill has got to be focused only like a laser on average people and on working people and on poor people, and getting money to them, and also helping get additional equipment to hospitals. We ought to be doing this right now anyway.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, we're going to, and people are going to say, some conservatives and some people are going to say, no, we can't afford to do this. I think the response to all of those people is that we were the strongest and biggest and best economy in the world, the richest economy in the history of humankind. We still are. We're a $21 trillion economy. The fact that we can't spend $2 or $3 or $4 or $10 trillion saving our people, enabling them to survive, and this is a matter of survival, is absurd. Of course we can.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no limit to the amount of money we ought to be spending right now. When we come out, we're going to be a very productive economy once again. But right now, there should not be any concern about spending too much money. What we should be concerned about is spending it in the wrong way.
I agree. And something that was infuriating about the Senate bill is that corporations got nearly 4 times as much money as hospitals fighting this fight on the front lines. And I feel like that's just a perfect microcosm of how unequal our system is and who gets the power and who doesn't. And so obviously we're doing this live stream from quarantine, which means it's a great time to be reading books. And your latest book, The System, Who Rigged It, How We Fix It, it came out earlier this week. And I know it feels weird to kind of promote a new book during these times, but I mean this with total honesty. Your book is so, so important right now. I mean, if people want to understand how we got to the place we are today, your book is a perfect roadmap to understand why corporations have more power than workers and consumers, why politicians place more weight on corporate profits over people's health. I mean, I really could not recommend it enough. So I've been reading it in quarantine, and it's really been helping me process what's going on today. So,
well, thank you, Katie. It's not the most auspicious week to come out with a new book, but we've been talking a lot about anger in this broadcast, and one way in which I kind of channel my anger is into writing and writing books, and hoping that people read them and take to heart what the books say. I mean, the reason I write and I teach, and the reason you and I work for Inequality Media, is because we want to get the truth out. We want to help people understand and get the information they need, because that's how democracy must work. That's the kind of foundation stone of democracy, is people who are informed and can take the information and the frameworks they have and actually exercise their right to change the government and make it respond to them.
Yeah, I totally agree. And On that note, we are just about wrapped up. So stay safe, stay sane during quarantine. I'm just to summarize from what we discussed, billionaires want people to die just for some stock market gains, and Republicans don't want poor people to have too much money in a global crisis. So I think those are the two main takeaways from what we discussed today.
Well, I think yeah, and I think that also there is this underlying question of morality, of public morality.
Yes.
And we entitled our series "The Common Good" because that is a real ongoing living proposition that becomes more and more apparent in times just like this. And I hope that everybody who is watching and listening, I hope you'll subscribe to The Common Good. I hope that you found this interesting and informative. Most importantly, though, I hope you and your families are safe and continue to stay safe. And as citizens, not just as participants, just as viewers, I hope you take what we have said very personally in terms of politics next November. It seems like an eternity away, but it won't be. Katie, thanks so much. See you soon.
Thank you, Bob. I'll see you next week.